So most people automatically associate communism and the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx. I want to talk about an idea that I think is even more influential that Marx came up with, that he, in my opinion, should really be much more known for than even the manifesto. And that's the idea of historical materialism. But before we dig into that, we have to sort of rewind a little bit and talk about an incredibly famous German philosopher. If you've had any philosophy course, you probably at least heard this name, and that's Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He lived from 1770 to 1831. After he dies in Germany, some of his students and others kind of form a group and carry on his legacy and critique his work and publish their findings and really try to continue on his ideas. This group is called the Young Hegelians. Marx himself is a member of the Young Hegelians in the beginning. Some others that you might have heard of that are somewhat famous, Bruno Bauer is an example, Ludwig Feuerbach is an example, and in fact Marx's letters to Feuerbach are sort of a famous publication where he actually begins forming his idea of historical materialism. But we need to really talk about one of Hegel's ideas that was really influential in the time and still is today. And you've probably, like I said, heard of this idea before if you've had any philosophy course. And that is the idea of idealism. This is sort of Hegel's theory for how history evolves, how humanity evolves, and how we go really from one era to the next. So he has this term he uses is Geist, which is German loosely translated to spirit or mind. And for Hegel, this is the collective consciousness of society. So the way that we live our lives, the way that we think about the world, our traditions and culture and languages, he refers to this as Geist. He says that the Geist evolves, basically human consciousness, the consciousness of humanity evolves over time as a result of sort of the conflict, or you could use the word debate, between opposing ideas. And sometimes it's not an overt, like, public debate between two people. He says sometimes this just happens as a result of the course of living our daily lives. He calls this the dialectic of the collective consciousness. If you know anything about philosophy, the dialectic discourse is an idea from Plato, and it's essentially, in Plato's version, two people coming together with opposing ideas through this dialectical discourse, really deconstructing each other's arguments, using logic to do so, and then in the end, kind of agreeing on some sort of compromise of their two ideas kind of joined into one. So Hegel takes this idea from Plato and applies it to the collective consciousness of humanity, and says at any given time in society, there are dueling ideas. And as a result of us just living our daily lives, we usually end up kind of somewhere in the middle of those ideas. The key here is that humanity is evolving as a result of the change in their ideas. So he says, really the foundation of human society, and he argues human existence itself, is the ideas of human beings. And then those ideas impact the material world. So the ideas of society, things like ideology, culture, religion, politics, law, education, media, art, that those things basically come first, and they're the first to evolve. And then the material world is just a manifestation of those ideas. So that's the real world, the economy, the modes of production, how we interact with one another, how we interact with our environment, that those are really just created out of our way of thinking. So history evolves as ideas evolve. So that's Hegel's, in a nutshell, really, idea of idealism. And you might hear this referred to as dialectical idealism. Human consciousness, this collective consciousness, and humanity evolving through the dialectic of ideas, the conflict and opposition and sort of figuring out of ideas through the course of our daily lives. So Marx and Engels both were young Hegelians. Marx really loved Hegel's ideas and his philosophies and wrote some things himself, kind of continuing Hegel's legacy. But at one point in his life, he breaks away from the young Hegelians and finds himself sort of disagreeing with this theory of idealism. He lays this out first, some of the basic foundations, in these letters to Feuerbach is the title of these documents, and they're basically letters that he was sending back and forth between himself and Ludwig Feuerbach. Then that's sort of a really rudimentary outline of his theory. In the German Ideology is where he really sort of lays the foundation and makes an argument for his theory. His theory is the exact opposite of Hegel's dialectical idealism. His is sometimes referred to as dialectical materialism or historical materialism, or sometimes even just shortened to materialism. And his idea is essentially exactly the opposite of idealism. He argues that the material world, the way that we interact with our environment, comes first and came first, really, in human existence, and that our ideas are merely just a result of the way that we interact with reality, or that reality exists. And he gives us two terms here, the material base and the superstructure. The material base being sort of the foundation of society, the reality, our economy, our modes of production, how we create the things that we need for human survival. The superstructure being the ideas of society, culture, religion, morality, politics, law, education, media, art, all of those types of things. So for Marx, it's the material world. So just a few quotes from the German Ideology, and here he's kind of sort of addressing the Hegelians. Some people argue this is almost somewhat satirical, where he's kind of tongue-in-cheek attacking them. So I'm just going to read some quotes here. Quote, "The production of ideas, of conceptions, of consciousness is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. Conceiving, thinking, the mental intercourse of men appear at this stage as the direct efflux of their material behavior. The way of thinking, this mental intercourse of men, appears at this stage a direct efflux of their mental behavior." So he's really saying here, the way that we think is really a result of the way that we act, the way that we behave. Another quote here, "In direct contrast to the German philosophy," here he's addressing the young Hegelians, "which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. That is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from real active men, and on the basis of their real life process, we demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process," unquote. So in contrast to Hegel's theory, right, it's kind of interesting because he says, in direct contrast to German philosophy, even though he himself is a German philosopher, that kind of gives you an idea of how pervasive Hegel's ideas were. He can basically just say German philosophy and everyone knows that that's Hegel he's talking about. In direct contrast to this, which descends from heaven and earth, here, with my idea of historical materialism, we ascend from earth to heaven. We start out in the material world, and that gives birth to our ideas. Just one more quote here. Quote, "Life involves before everything else, eating and drinking, a habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed, this is an historical act, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled merely in order to sustain human life," unquote. He's saying that human beings in the very beginning started out interacting with the material world to sort of get the things that they needed to survive. We think of Maslow's hierarchy in the very first level, right? Shelter, food, water, basic subsistence. Marx says that is the first thing that humans do in order to survive. And from there, they develop this consciousness, these ways of thinking, these traditions, this culture, this art, these theories. So this is in direct contrast to Hegel's idea of idealism. So, as an example of materialism in the real world, Marx thinks that humanity evolves as a result of opposing material forces kind of working themselves out throughout daily life. So as an example, which we'll get to much more in depth later in the semester, Marx writes a lot about economic systems and modes of production. So he will argue that capitalism is an economic system, and at the same time there is this idea of socialism, right? Kind of two different ends of the spectrum. And he argues that over time, capitalism will fall and some version of socialism leading into communism will win out. Think about the fact that those aren't actually people thinking, that those are real world economic systems. That's the reality of people interacting with machines and with the environment to create what they need to survive. And we'll get to Marx's theory for how capitalism comes into being later on, and we'll really get to see his theory of materialism in action. Okay, so why is this important? Prior to Marx, because you might be thinking, okay, he just basically flipped Hegel's ideas upside down. How was that so hard? Prior to Marx's version of materialism, Hegel's idea was basically the only idea going, and it was really the most prominent way that people interpreted human history. So historians and philosophers and economists, they all sort of analyzed the ideas of different eras throughout history and used those to study the people and their behavior. It wasn't until Marx establishes this idea of historical materialism that people actually start paying attention to the real tangible sort of artifacts and objects and modes of production in different eras in society. So this is a complete 180, a completely opposite way of interpreting human history. I can't stress enough how impactful that was. Just as an example, when you go to a museum nowadays, what do you largely see? Right? You largely see artifacts from different eras. We learn about the pyramids, we see sarcophaguses, we see pottery and clothing. We see material objects. That is a result of Karl Marx's theory of historical materialism. If materialism had never been come into existence, we would merely see evidence of people's ideas, right? We would merely see the religion of a certain era and the traditions of a certain era and the political systems of a certain era, and we wouldn't really be concerned with the material objects that these people had created. So people often, my students will say, well, he just really came up with the opposite idea of Hegel's theory. But to put it in a modern context, let's say as an example, obviously the foundation of our society now is really science and logic and reason. And as silly as it might sound, think about if someone came up with the opposite idea of science, and as soon as they did, everyone sort of realized, wow, that is an interesting alternative, and we're going to start doing that. For us, it seems silly because we can't even really comprehend what the opposite of science would be. That is exactly was the same when it came to Marx and his idea of materialism. It seems silly that someone could come up with an idea that was the opposite of Hegel's because Hegel's ideas were so pervasive throughout history. So when Marx comes up with this idea of materialism, everyone is sort of taken aback and had never even really conceived of something like this, even though now, in retrospect, we can say, well, it was basically just the opposite of Hegel's idea, but you have to understand how sort of incredibly difficult it was for someone to ever come up with an idea that was the opposite of that, even though now to us it seems sort of simple. So this has a huge impact on almost every discipline, at least in the social sciences, from history to philosophy to economics to sociology, obviously, political science. An alternative way to interpret how humanity evolves and how human history evolves. And in my opinion, this is probably the most influential theory that Marx had. It probably, in my opinion at least, wasn't the manifesto, despite the impact that had on humanity in different manifestations. I argue it's actually materialism, as Marx lays it out, that gives us a new idea about how to think human history. So I'll just leave you with a question, because it's important to understand that it's not as if Marx wrote this idea about materialism and then everyone sort of threw up their arms and abandoned idealism and adopted materialism. In fact, there are still people fall in either camp to this day. When we talk about Weber, later on, he was an idealist, and he sort of writes one of his works is sort of attacking in a roundabout way Marx's idea of materialism. So it wasn't as if everyone sort of got on board with this, but it was an interesting sort of alternative thought. So I'll leave you with this question. Which do you believe in? How do you think that humanity evolves? You've probably never thought of this before in your life, but think about a real world example. Let's say when the smartphone was first invented, was that a result of people just sort of sitting in a room and coming up with new ideas? Or was that a result of us really out interacting with one another and interacting with the world and the evolution of technology and modes of production that eventually gave birth to this new technology? It's sort of an interesting thing to debate, and there's really no right or wrong answer, but you usually find yourself falling in one camp or the other, or some combination of the two.